Could we be moving faster? Yes. One of the things I would like to see most specifically is a joint effort across the government, all sectors of the government, as well as the leading commercial actors, to have a transparent discussion about where the opportunities are for commercial space and where the government feels that it can rely more heavily on those things.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Space Café Radio. I'm Yvette Gonzalez, and today I'm here in Prague at the 8th Prague Space Security Conference. Today I'm joined by Peter Hayes, a leading authority on U.S. space policy and national security, serving as a professional lecturer at George Washington University's Space Policy Institute while advising the U.S. Department of Defense and the Center for Strategic International Studies. He's a retired Air Force officer with over 25 years of service, including roles as a C-141 pilot and space policy educator. Dr. Hayes has shaped significant national policy and earned recognition, including the National Intelligence Professional Award. Welcome to our show.
Thanks, Yvette. It's great to be with you. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
And I have to say thank you for your service.
Thank you for thanking me.
We really enjoyed the panel this morning. You moderated a panel called Updates on Space Domain Awareness and Threat Mitigation. So what are the most pressing developments in space threats that conference attendees should be tracking right now?
As we discussed this morning, I think two recent events really stand out in my mind. And those are the Russian nuclear anti-satellite weapon, about which there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. I guess the good news in that regard is that satellite has started tumbling, as Paul Graziani showed us this morning with one of his graphics. But exactly what the Russians are up to with that and how that violates their obligation under Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty not to station a weapon of mass destruction or a nuclear weapon anywhere in space is certainly very concerning. And last spring, a little more than a year ago, the Russians even denied their obligation under that at the UN Security Council. So they were given every opportunity to reaffirm their commitment, which they already signed aboard. So that's extremely disturbing. What most analysts believe would happen in that regard is probably about a $500 billion initial event in damages and destruction of low Earth orbit satellites. And then the total economic impact of that would probably be about $2 to $3 trillion. So it's a really significant event. In my mind, that really outshadows everything else. A second one I'll just point out is a refueling operation on a Chinese satellite in geostationary orbit, and that's called the SJ-21. And why that's disturbing and concerning is that in, I believe it was January of 21, that satellite grappled a Chinese dead BeiDou satellite and very quickly moved it up to the graveyard orbit above geostationary orbit. So the concern there being that if the Chinese could do that to one of their own satellites, they could no doubt do it to one of our satellites. So they haven't really done something very threatening like that to one of somebody else's satellites, but they're demonstrating that capability. And as many of the most important U.S. space capabilities are in geostationary orbit. So that certainly got a lot of people's attention. So I would really highlight those two among the many things that were discussed on that panel.
Yeah, and I think it was really demonstrated here in the opening that this is now going to be an annual conference because this threat landscape is rapidly escalating and evolving.
Yes, and I really applaud the Prague Security Studies Institute because they've recognized that. They've been running this conference now. This is the 8th one, but it just does seem to get more and more attention each year, and it's unfortunate that the threats are driving things, but I think they've made absolutely the right decision to give this more attention. And really, I want to give a shout out to the organizers of this because to the best of my knowledge, there's really no other conference that brings together people from around the world in such an intimate setting as is available here. So there are many other space conferences, but they tend to be a lot larger, and many of the keynote speakers kind of come and go, do a touch and go at the conference. That's not the way they want to run things here. So almost all the people that have been doing these high-level jobs or have recently retired out of them are going to to be available for everybody at the conference, and you can get into a dialogue with them. I'll point out that I had about a half-hour conversation with Mallory Stewart, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Space Policy last year. She's no longer in that position, but you just don't get that kind of opportunity at other venues.
Not at all. And you mentioned it this morning and how accessible everyone is here, and I think that's the point.
I think it really is. They work very hard to have the right people that want to have these kind of dialogues, and they also create an excellent mix between junior and more seasoned people such as myself.
That's right. And that's important. We're talking about knowledge management, really. We're talking about the capacity to pass on institutional capacity, if I can say that, for the industry. And as we forge forward, I want to talk about a little bit about current state of space domain awareness. For you, where are the critical gaps that keep you up at night?
I guess one of the things that's of greatest concern to me is that the way Paul Graziani framed things up about how quickly many things are moving with respect to the threat, and then commercial activity moving so quickly, but the U.S. government is not nearly at that pace. So one of the things that's been most disappointing to me is the pace at which the transition between the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce on safety of flight has been rolling out. Now, I'm really not blaming the folks at the Department of Commerce, and there's been a variety of issues. They mentioned this morning about how it took years to get their funding and things like that. But one would have hoped that this would have been further down the road than it is today. And I just don't believe that we're going to make a lot of progress until we have a lot more solid foundation that is provided by the U.S. government worldwide, free basis for doing that really provides the foundation. The good news in that regard is that the commercial activities and the higher and higher fidelity stuff that they're doing really supports a variety of things. Another thing I've learned is that I think people have the wrong idea that there's just kind of old school sensors that are contributing to this. The more modern approaches to this combine many sensors, and it's a pattern of life in the same way that we looked at other things from an intelligence perspective. So I believe that's going to increasingly make space more transparent. One of the challenges for the United States government in that regard will be learning how to hide in plain sight or operate in just different ways. But we saw with aircraft that there was a lot of focus on creating low observable stealth technology. I think we're at the infancy of doing that in space, and I would anticipate that some types of satellites will increasingly be built around those kind of approaches.
Okay, you've introduced this idea, and the conversation has been all day about commercial space. And given that you've worked so extensively with DoD, how effectively are we integrating commercial space capabilities into our national security space architecture?
I actually think there's been just this last year, and it really, I don't think, got enough attention here. Both the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Space Force released commercial space strategy. The Office of the Secretary of Defense, it was a slightly different title. It was Commercial Space Integration Strategy, and then the Space Force just did Commercial Space Strategy. I think both those documents are very accessible. They're very comprehensive, and they lay out a really doable approach. One of the things that was really shocking to me, frankly, is that when we talked to the lawyers about that, who obviously signed off on this and made sure the government wasn't going too far with what it was going to write in these documents, there's really nothing else like this for any other domain. At some level, that's not good, but it's also highlighting that when it comes to space, it's really leading the pack, and it's really working hard to leverage all of these great and growing commercial space activities. Having said all that, it's always a glass half empty and half full. Could we be moving faster? Yes. One of the things I would like to see most specifically is I believe there needs to be a joint effort across the government, all sectors of the government, as well as the leading commercial actors, to have a transparent discussion about where the opportunities are for commercial space and where the government feels that it can rely more heavily on those things. Then there just basically needs to be a rank-ordered listing. And I would just say, when it comes to things like nuclear command and control, I don't think the United States government is going to outsource that. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it could be things like environmental monitoring, which perhaps could be completely a commercial or international partner contribution. So within that spectrum of things, I believe the U.S. government just needs to lay out a rank-ordered list and say, here's the things we would most like your efforts on. And by making it transparent and a joint effort to produce that thing, then there's a lot more predictability on the part of industry, and they can pick and choose what they might want to become more involved in and not maybe go down rabbit holes that aren't going to be as productive for them.
It harkens back to one of the comments on a later panel, which was, there is no playbook. We're writing it.
That is true. Again, it's glass half empty or half full, but I think we are getting there. We don't have that one-to-end list of things, but I think there's greater understanding and appreciation of what the government wants and what industry can deliver. And I don't want to create the impression that this is quick and easy. It's hard. Government doesn't have a great ability to understand commercial opportunities and where investment opportunities and insurance and all those kind of things that the government doesn't have to do in those kind of ways. But I think it's learning. And I think on the opposite side, industry is learning more and more. And it's not just the big primes that have traditionally done these things. I think a lot of much smaller, innovative companies are getting involved in the mix. And certainly things like the Space Development Agency is really accelerating that. Across the whole spectrum, I'm really quite encouraged. I think that there's a lot of good activity, and I sense that in many areas it's really accelerating.
Okay. And if we look about space domain awareness sharing with allies, how do you assess the balance between transparency and operational security?
That is one of those key balance issues, and maybe I'll ding the U.S. government here because I don't think overall the U.S. government has worked through this as much as they need to. Our traditional approaches to this with things like exclusion lists really are anachronistic, and they, with today's range of capabilities and knowledge about what's actually up there, the net result of having an exclusion list just paints a flag around the things that aren't listed in the catalog. So that's not the right approach. And our government in the U.S. has not yet come up with an alternative structure. Again, I talked about a little bit hiding in plain sight and exploring ways to make satellites less observable. So those are things that I think will be increasingly important. For really at least a decade now, there's also been a call from almost every senior leader to include even President Obama saying that stuff is too classified. And if they explored that a little bit more deeply, they would find that the poster child for things being overly classified is space. I retired from my contractor job in the Pentagon about a year ago. And one of the things I learned is that even the most senior people don't necessarily have access to everything that they need to have access to in order to do their job. So we are creating our own worst enemy at some level. You mentioned I work for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Jim Clapper was the DNI when I was there, and he allowed himself to be quoted in a book called Top Secret America. And one of his quotes was that only God has oversight of all these programs. And of course, he's a super user who could have access to anything. But over the decades, there have been so many of those special access and special SAP and SAR programs. We just don't know how many of them there are, and they tend to be so highly controlled that you may know about things that would really be of great importance to what you're doing right next door to them, but you just don't know what they're doing. So I can guarantee you we're at least collecting on ourselves in some instances.
Yeah, I think this has been a common conversation today, is that we get in our own way. And it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. And I would even say unfurls in the next 5 to 10 years.
I think, again, in my estimation, the ability to just continue with the normal way of doing business is going to grow increasingly untenable. And people talk about just turning on the lights in space. And again, it's a combination of all those pattern of life things and big data analytics and machine learning and things. Also new sensors like the square kilometer array, which is a synoptic view of the entire sky every night. So when you combine all of those things together, it's just really hard to hide in the ways that we have in the past. That's somewhat of a different problem than within the U.S. government overclassifying things or not even really having a process to take them out of SAP-SAR channels and just get them down to top secret and SCI level. And there is a greater ability to share things at that level, both with industry and with our international partners. So even just taking them out of SAP-SAR is going to be very important. Of course, we'd like to bring many things down to a much lower level than that.
Yeah. So let's consider the U.S. Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications, or NC3, modernization. Your recent Atlantic Council work highlighted space-based nuclear command and control. And given the vulnerabilities we're observing, is our reliance on space-based NC3 systems becoming a strategic liability rather than an asset?
I don't think we're really there. I think there's very good recognition about how much more threatening the space environment is. And there's been really, if you have to point to one area where organizations like the Space Development Agency and Space Systems Command and the Missile Defense Agency are putting a great deal of effort, this would be really one of the success stories. Having said all that, it's clear that the way we traditionally did business is just also increasingly untenable. But I think we're on a fairly good path towards correcting that. Of course, there are also game changers. We talked briefly about the Russian nuke in space. So if we create proliferated low Earth orbit constellations that are supporting NC3 that are vulnerable to that, then we are really just incentivizing the Russians to use that. And that's about the exact wrong thing that we want to do. So if we do anything like that and they are certified as part of the NC3 system, they have to be hardened against that, at least to a certain degree. And you can do that. That's not the normal model for putting things in low Earth orbit. It's interesting, though, because things above low Earth orbit are in a naturally much higher radiation environment. So they're already using radiation-hardened chips and have other things built into them. It's really just in low Earth orbit where this is such a big threat. So again, if we're going to have things, proliferated LEO systems, if they're going to be supporting NC3, they've got to be hardened against that effect.
Okay, and I think you went right down to my next question, which is that critics argue also that we're creating new vulnerabilities, as you pointed out. And how do you respond to the argument that we're making our nuclear deterrent more fragile and not more resilient?
I guess I just disagree with that. I think that, again, there's such good recognition of how the strategic space environment has changed, and there's so much effort to develop a wider variety of much more resilient systems that I don't perceive things that way. To me, the biggest challenge is exactly what is and isn't in the NC3 network. And you will see folks like at the Missile Defense Agency and the Space Development Agency saying these are systems that can support NC3. But traditional NC3 systems are certified. That's a very rigorous process where we have great assurance that these things are going to do exactly what they're supposed to do and are hardened and made resilient against a lot of different effects. That makes them a lot more expensive. They're exquisite satellites. John Hyten called them big, fat, juicy targets. So that's not the right way to do things going forward. But what the U.S. government hasn't yet figured out is exactly how it's going to reach some level of certification. And it may be that individual satellites aren't certified, but the network is certified. So it's just a different approach. But at the end of the day, I believe things must be at that level for us to have confidence. You don't want to wake up the president because a bunch of cheap satellites told you something and it's not right.
And I have to say, I'm happy to hear all this because when I think about how quickly a decade passes, how quickly technology has changed in our lifetimes, I can't, even with AI and machine learning, I can't imagine in a decade or two from now what will emerge as the new and normal technology.
I'm really glad you brought that up. One of the things, again, I don't think there's great appreciation for is our current NC3 system is an analog system. It hasn't even reached the digital age in most components. And at some level, that's good because there are less threat vectors. Now, transitioning is going to be a significant challenge, but we absolutely need to be thinking 30, 40 years hence because it's likely that whatever we're building today will be operational that long. And you brought up AI. I'm very glad you did because AI, what's that going to look like 40 years hence? And how do we preserve the human safeguards that are essential for this to work in the ways that we want it to? We've all seen all those movies and things that are very scary. I don't think we're driving toward that, but the issue is really how hard are we working and how much understanding do we have about these eventualities? These things will be embedded in all future systems going forward. Our challenge is really to preserve those human safeguards, human agency, and not just have some kind of superficial, there's a human in the loop and they'll be brought in at the last second and over to you, Mr. President. candidate for pressing the button. That's just not going to work. So we need to think long and hard about how to really make it a enhanced decision-making process, which I do believe machine learning and artificial intelligence can provide, but not unless we really work hard on how to create it in those kind of ways.
So my final question, what's the one space security policy change you'd implement tomorrow if you had the authority?
I think I really would work on lowering the classification level of things or just having a zero-based review, particularly of all the SAPSAR programs, because I think there would be a great opportunity to move many of them, either just remove them completely because whatever it was is now no longer relevant, or at least move them down to a top secret SCI level. The reason I highlight that is because, as you've been talking about, we have greater and greater reliance on our international and commercial partners. And if they're excluded from even knowing about these things, you're not going to achieve very good cooperative process there. So I think that could really be a key way to move things downfield in a significant way.
Thank you so much for that. Peter, thank you again for your time and for offering your incredible insights on our Space Cafe Radio.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This was fun.
And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Cafe Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.